Well, let's get started. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. My name is Travis Reynolds. I'm an assistant professor of community development and applied economics at the University of Vermont. CDAE is what back in the day used to be sort of the ag econ department in the ag school. Today represents sort of a combining of public communications, community development, international development, and entrepreneurship majors. So a catch-all for communications, small business, and a lot of research on Vermont. I'm also a sugar maker from the Northeast Kingdom. My family taps 6,000 trees in the town of Stannard. Anybody been to Stannard? Yeah, all right. And we are certified organic. We are certified kosher. We are recognized bird friendly. And we sell everything that we make from our 6,000 trees plus a bit from our neighbors direct to consumers, restaurants, nothing bulk for several years. So I approach these kinds of questions about what is the Vermont brand in maple syrup, both as an economist and as a family farm that's been trying to sell Vermont maple syrup almost entirely outside of Vermont. Most of what we sell as a farm goes to Seattle, Washington, Oregon, California for a bunch of years. So I'll be drawing a little bit today on some statistics from this report, Maple Syrup Markets and Growth Opportunities, a recent report that was put out by the state of Vermont. And let's go. So, starting out as an academic, I did a good review of literature. The review of literature on what has been published in the peer-reviewed literature on maple syrup over the past 100 years is kind of interesting just in terms of highlighting the trends about what was being said by scientists and what was being said in the general public about maple syrup over these periods of time. So early on in the early 1900s, a lot of the scientific publications were about detecting adulteration in maple syrup. Some of the earliest research was on detecting when somebody was trying to pass beet sugar off as maple syrup, when somebody was trying to mix and match or add potential contaminants to maple syrup and pass it off in this market. As you zoom forward into the 40s and 50s, you're sort of in the new food science era, where we've got all of these technologies for testing what the nutrient properties of maple syrup are, what the potential nutritive value of maple syrup is. Pure maple syrup nutritive value published in Science in 1964, like flagship publications paying attention to the potential of this product. 1970s, a bit of bad press as word gets out about the use of paraformaldehyde as a standard tapping practice. When my dad was a student in the College of Agriculture at the University of Vermont, we still have the books that he was given that tell you how to use the paraformaldehyde tablets and put them in your tap hole to freshen that tap hole and prevent it from healing up over the course of the season. So these are things that were actively embraced by the sector, actively promoted by Extension Services, and ended up being not such a great public relations idea as you make the connection between something that sounds decidedly not natural in a product that has long been marketed for its natural properties, its nutritive properties. As we get into this sort of real bump in literature, now we're talking the tech of maple syrup. The entrance of reverse osmosis, testing what reverse osmosis can do, looking at vacuum systems, what vacuum does within the tree, what vacuum does to productivity, and also throughout this period a whole boom in studies on the economics of maple syrup as we go from maple syrup being sort of a combination hobby industry, off-season activity for small farms to an industry in which you can do economic studies about cost viability because people are crunching the numbers on those margins. This most recent spike has been a combination about 50-50 of food science So really sort of looking at, again, the chemical properties of maple syrup, the potential industrial applications of maple syrup and maple syrup byproducts, and climate change. Climate change impacts, climate change consequences, movement in the viable habitat for maple syrup, for maple trees, projections of what climate is likely to mean for maple syrup is what is being written about a lot today. I gave a talk a couple of years back now with the title "The End of Sugaring." Not saying the end of maple syrup production, but the end of sugaring. In that we all sort of have in our mind this image of what maple sugaring is, of what sugaring time means, and that increasingly, with a combination of economic and market factors compounded by climatic and simple viability factors, is becoming increasingly less and less the reality in the maple syrup sector. The majority of maple syrup today is not being produced in the way that maple syrup sort of is envisioned in the heads of many consumers and in the heads of many producers. Thinking about changes in the woods associated with maple production, changes in the sugar house associated with maple production, certainly changes in the market associated with maple production, and what do those changes mean for producers? What do those changes mean for the possible economic viability of those traditional producers that are still producing things the way that people have in their heads? The end story here is a lot of the projections are pretty rough for small-scale, medium-scale producers. That we have lots of examples from economics, from other commodities markets, of the introduction of extraordinary technologies that allow us to improve the productivity of a crop, of the introduction of extraordinary processing technologies that are capital intensive but really, really reduce the marginal cost of production, that make us a lot more efficient. But those kinds of innovations tend to go hand in hand with declining bulk prices, with declining marginal prices to consumers. Essentially, those producers who adopt the new technologies enjoy increased production at somewhat lower prices. But those producers who don't adopt the new methods just see the lower prices and the lower prices and the lower prices, and eventually can no longer persist. Unless maple is not like other crops in the U.S. and is not like other sweeteners in the U.S., in which case maybe we can do something different. So, one of the things that Vermont has that a lot of places don't have is a heritage around maple syrup. There have been several talks, even just at the conference today, about the history of maple, about some of the largest, earliest, large-scale maple production distribution activities taking place right here in Vermont, or right up in St. Johnsbury, where we're looking at, for some portions of the U.S. population, Vermont maple syrup being something that is distinct from just maple syrup, being something that is linked to tradition, being something that is linked to place in a way that can't be recreated by somebody else. So a lot of new technologies that enhance production, a lot of things like vacuum that allow you to increase the sap that will come out of maple trees without necessarily meeting that specific climate band that really gave Vermont kind of its edge on production. A lot of those technologies can be adopted in a very large range. It's possible to produce maple syrup down into the Carolinas potentially. It's possible to produce maple syrup, certainly going far west. We don't know, what that western edge limit might be if people do start planting maple trees. It is not possible for another area, another state, to suddenly have a 300, 400, 500,000 year old heritage around a crop that is from a place. That's something that can't ever be recreated somewhere else. So you look at some of these old images from Vermont Life magazine. These are all archived by the state, sort of again as part of Vermont's heritage around this unique crop. And then you sort of put these kinds of old traditional images in the context of the statement, the harvesting of maple sap for the production of maple maple syrup has become the largest commercial use of temperate deciduous trees for food production worldwide. It is an extraordinary crop. And is it possible for that extraordinary crop to be tied to Vermont in a way that maintains its sort of local specialness, that maintains a price premium, even as that extraordinary crop's viable production area expands or shifts? So, what is Vermont maple? I want to pitch this presentation in part as a call for help. So at the University of Vermont, we are trying to do research that is to the benefit of Vermont, that is to the benefit of Vermont maple producers. And what we've started to do here is ask some questions through large surveys, representative survey of Vermont households, asking them, what do you care about in the maple sector? What are you willing to pay for in terms of paying a price premium for different ways of producing maple syrup? We've also been surveying Vermont producers and saying, what are you trying to do with your operations? What are you most concerned about? What are the threats that you feel you are facing? What are the risks that you think someone might be able to help you with? What we really hope to get from you is feedback on the questions that we've been asking, but also suggestions on the types of questions that we should be asking. We'll be running surveys of Vermont consumers every January for the next 3 years, and we'll be running surveys of Vermont producers every May for the next 3 years. So tell us what to ask and answer those surveys if you get a call or an email from us. Some of my interest in this what is Vermont maple arose from some publications, popular media publications just a few years ago, in which statements like this were being made. It's the same product. It's still just the sap from the maple tree that was boiled down and evaporated to make maple syrup. Only the collection method is changing, and the industry has already weathered a lot of change. It's definitely something very different, but tubing looks different than buckets. Most people don't use horses to collect their sap anymore. Not everyone wears plaid in the forest. Anybody know what this quote was in reference to? What technological innovation they were talking about?
Vacuum.
Pretty obvious to change from buckets to tubing.
Yeah, that sounds like it, but
Probably 1952.
They were talking about this.
Oh, yeah.
They were talking about
Really?
the shift to sapling production.
Not even true.
Huh.
Yeah.
So the notion that it is now technologically and economically, depending on your projections and assumptions about what prices will do, viable to plant a field of maple saplings after 5, 10, 15 years, whatever your threshold points are, lop the tops of those saplings off, suck out the sap from the sapling. It'll be a really, really low concentration of sugar, but you can fit so many saplings on an acre of land that you can make the math work. And you can boil this product down and you can end up with a solution that is 67% sugar produced from a maple tree in the state of Vermont. Is that pure Vermont maple syrup?
technically, yes.
Legally, absolutely yes. Whether it is or not
No.
is real interesting, right?
Yeah, it's not really.
All right. How about genetically modified sugar mix? 20 years ago, nobody talked about genetic modification for trees. Today, there are new technologies where gene editing is much cheaper than it ever used to be. Even with gene editing innovations, even with improved tools that let us identify, is this genetic code associated with high sugar concentration or low sugar concentration? Is this genetic code associated with high growth, low growth? Genetically modifying trees was not really something people were talking about. Today, in some sectors, they are. And particularly if you can introduce that genetically modified tree into a production system that allows you to plant a whole bunch of saplings side by side in high density and extract that and boil it down and make a solution that is 67% sugar and produced in the state of Vermont. Is that pure Vermont maple syrup? Technically, right. And so some of these questions that are being raised here, some of these sort of reasons that I think it's important to start asking these questions now, is that today nobody's saying, well, you know, we really should get rid of the pipeline because buckets are traditional. And nobody's saying, oh, you know, we really should get rid of the reverse osmosis because boiling it down with wood is traditional. Once those technological shifts happen, it's much more difficult to go back. So if we can see that the industry is changing, if we can see that these things might be coming down the line, we want to ask questions about what Vermont maple syrup is and what this product means from a marketing perspective. So when we say that there have been changes, it's not just in the woods, it's certainly in the sugar house. Folks know this one. So Sweet Tree Holdings up in Iowa Pond, extraordinarily efficient, world-class production facility. Extraordinary economic benefits, 100 jobs in an area that needs them. Founded in 2013 by a capital management company, by a Connecticut-based hedge fund. Prices were high. Sold in 2016, now owned by a Montreal-based investment fund. The largest single-source producer of maple syrup in the world is in Vermont. And it is owned by a Canadian hedge fund. I'm not going to ask the question, is that Vermont pure maple syrup? But it raises these huge questions about, does the notion of Vermont pure maple extend to the production practice? Does the notion of Vermont pure maple extend to the ownership structure? Or what does it mean? Yeah.
So along that same line, there was an article 2 or 3 years ago, Crown Maple out of Sandy, Vermont, has a lot of maple. Their sap is produced in Vermont, but their syrup is produced in New York, so it's considered New York syrup.
So that was my next example. Copy. Look at this. Have folks seen this story?
No.
Okay, so Crown Maple was basically it was a family that made a purchase of a large recreational property in the Hudson Valley. Discovered that it had a whole bunch of maple trees on it. Crunched some numbers, did some math, and had the resources to develop that maple resource and made it into an extraordinarily well-branded, now nationally distributed name. Lots and lots of market connections, revenues, high prices, and branded as being a single estate product, a real differentiator in the maple syrup segment. And so I put this up here as being, changes in the market, as when Crown puts on their website that their high efficiency steam evaporators and their highly advanced production process is more sanitary than any maple produced on the market. Who are they talking about? When they say we are a single estate product, a differentiator in the maple syrup segment, and that goes on to say, unlike many other large maple syrup brands which buy from lots of producers and blend it all together and sell it out as a blend, who are they talking about? So when you don't actively define what your product is, other people define your product for you.
Yes.
Other people differentiate their products, identify the attributes of their products in ways that could be beneficial to all, in ways that could advance the maple sector, or in ways that could strengthen those who have the resources to define a clear brand and define their clear brand as somehow being better than the others that are out on the market. So these things matter. So again, in the context of the U.S., folks are aware of these kinds of patterns that maple's produced all over the place. Lots of different states, lots of different places where you can get maple syrup. The big characteristics of Vermont maple syrup being, hovering right around the 2 million gallon mark for the past several years in a row, right around the 50% of all U.S. maple production coming out of the state of Vermont, past several years in a row, and by and large, the lowest prices to maple producers anywhere in the country are realized by the state of Vermont for the past several years in a row. The only state with lower prices to producers being Maine, which is also the only state in the union with a larger proportion of their production sold bulk, where everybody makes their syrup, puts it in barrels, and sells it bulk at exactly the same time. So Maine and Vermont competing for the lowest prices for maple syrup to producers in the country. So what does all of this mean? Sometimes you sort of hear this pushback that, like, well, the Vermont name isn't really strong enough to extend past New England. The Vermont name means a whole lot to Vermonters, but it doesn't really mean anything to Arizonans. And I think that's an empirical question, and I also think it's very much a product of investment. It's not that the Vermont name just either means something to Arizona or it doesn't. It's that the Vermont name is either projected to Arizona as meaning something or it is not. And who is doing the projection? What is the message? What is being said in promoting that Vermont brand? We're talking about half of the production in the U.S. Like, we're not talking about a tiny bit of the sector. We are talking about something that is substantial, that has potential anyway to reach far. So the sort of overarching framing here is we're doing studies of maple consumers' preferences and willingness to pay. So what attributes of maple syrup, what attributes of production in the woods, processing in the sugar house, or marketing in the market are consumers willing to pay price premiums for? And we're saying what are the production practices that we're looking at in the woods, in the sugar house, in the market? What are producers wanting to do? And are there overlaps where the producers want to do things that the consumers want to pay for? Or are there disagreements where the producers are changing their practices in ways that might harm the viability or the value of that Vermont label for subsets of consumers? Sort of also break this down along the axis of small scale to large scale as having very meaningful differences in the combinations of ways things are advertised, what is said about farms, what consumers think versus what reality is, and traditional up to high tech. So are you using traditional practices? Are you using the most modern practices? And labels like natural and efficient tend to get mixed up in between those things, where you can be small scale traditional and very natural, but maybe you can be high tech and natural. High tech and large scale, often very efficient, but efficient at what can be a question. So, some results from this past year. This is a survey of Vermont households. So it's a representative survey of households in the state of Vermont, between 600 and 700 households surveyed every year. And we asked them, how much maple syrup do you consume? So 60% of households are consuming a pint or less per over the past month. That means, even within Vermont, there is some potential for expansion of sales, for improvement in that segment of the market. I also sort of find it inspiring that we're talking about what, 18 plus 6 plus 3 gives you almost 30% of Vermont households are consuming a quart of syrup or more per month. And so we know this is just Vermont, and Vermont is kind of special and kind of unique. But what if a large portion of the United States populace of households was consuming a quart of syrup or more per month? It would be transformative. And if that was American-made syrup, extraordinary. Nothing against the Canadians. Some of it can be Canadian syrup too. It would have to be in a production sense. There's tremendous potential out there if we say that the high consumers are illustrative of what is potential consumption rates amongst the low consumers. Where do folks get their syrup? An overwhelming majority of consumers are either getting their syrup directly from a farmer or farm stand, or from one of these other categories. But one of these other categories includes a sizable portion of households that are making their own. So something like 1 in 12 are making their own maple syrup. Can you think of another food product where you would say 1 in 12 households in a state are associated in an intimate way with the production and consumption of this food product? It's extraordinary. Family, friend connections, gifts, etc. And then, only less than a third are consuming their maple syrup from a grocery store in the state of Vermont. So it is a different kind of economy, but again, that doesn't mean that we can't learn lessons from Vermonters that allow us to extrapolate to the broader sector. So one thing that we've done that from an economics perspective can be informative is we asked a series of willingness to pay questions, sort of pushing on how much consumers are willing to pay for that extra made in Vermont label. And the way you interpret this chart is you say that for an 8-ounce bottle of maple syrup amongst consumers, 100% of them are willing to pay $8. They'll pay $8 for that 8-ounce container. But 80% of them would be willing to pay $9, 40% willing to pay $10, and 20% would be willing to pay $11 or even $12. These are numbers that suggest strong potential for market segmentation, for product differentiation, that there are consumers even within the state of Vermont who are willing to pay a 50% price premium for something that is defined in a way that emphasizes that this is a Vermont family-produced product. That we shouldn't necessarily always be thinking about the bottom line sort of lowest price to market to consumers, that sometimes it's okay for some producers to have higher prices and target those who are willing to pay that higher. Just one more up here, I put kosher because it is something that is out there, small rates of Vermonters willing to pay extra. But again, when you go outside of Vermont and you're trying to sell to restaurants, trying to sell to food processors, those kinds of labels can matter quite a lot as well. When we talk about what should labeling be, I think it's useful to have a little bit of context on sort of where our current labeling rules came from. So when we look at national policies around maple, there are some fairly old rules rooted in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that basically say that you cannot sell misbranded or adulterated food across state lines. And adulterated means that it contains substances injurious to health. Misbranded means that the label is false or misleading and should be understandable by an ordinary individual. And so, when we think about our typical Vermont maple syrup can, that is Nixon, by the way. This is one of those historical archival photos just talking about, the Vermont brand of maple syrup reaching out across the country. It's gotten some good advertising over the years. What is on that traditional, typical can of Vermont maple syrup?
Well, it's got the horses and
It's got horses.
and the sleds.
It's got buckets, it's got the sleds, it's got the little wood-fired stack, and right? It's lovely. How about this one?
Well, it's got the cow. I mean, it makes it
It's
very rural.
part of a diversified farm,
That was us.
little wood pile,
Yeah, right.
beautiful little sugar house,
Yeah.
nice colors. One extra label right here.
Is that that's a
Organic.
Not organic.
Sure.
Yeah, GMO free. This is certified GMO free. Never mind that there is no genetically modified maple products on the market to date, but certified GMO free is a recognized label. Again, something that consumers are willing to pay for. How about this one? I enjoy talking about coops a little bit here. So, yeah, if we are to understand that this product is not misleading and should be understandable by the ordinary individual, then what we should understand is that Coombs maple syrup sold in this bottle is organic. It is associated with family farms. It is non-GMO produced. And it is made in a sugar house in the woods with a whole bunch of buckets that have been collected by a very talented teddy bear. Right? These are the types of claims that are put out that carry the popular narrative of what Vermont maple syrup is. In the absence of anyone clearly defining what your product is, those who are out there marketing are defining what your product is for you. And sometimes that can be terrific, and sometimes that can be bad. Sometimes that can be accurate, and sometimes that can be depicting things that are no longer true, potentially to the detriment of people who are still doing it in that way. Please.
The other thing is that you want to depict something for your buyer, like if they're Japanese or out west, they're not going to know what the sugar woods looks like with snow or sleds or maybe even a cow.
Totally.
You know?
Totally.
So you want to make it look appealing to them too, so they'll recognize it.
Yeah. All right. Vermont has its own set of maple syrup laws, its own set of maple labeling laws. Actually, nationally, some of the first written food labeling laws on the books, so not food contents, but food labeling laws, were in Vermont and were about maple syrup. Basically, in Vermont maple syrup shall only contain 100% maple syrup that is produced in Vermont. And if you violate that rule, then you are subject to formal penalties. Do folks remember in 2011 the sort of McDonald's story? So what happened here? McDonald's promoted their brand new fruit and maple oatmeal product that had not a trace of maple in it at all. The state of Vermont sues, saying that it is against Vermont law to market a product using the term maple in Vermont that is not a maple product. And the end result was that McDonald's had to change the product that they provided in Vermont. So it didn't reach outside of Vermont, but it did set the precedent that Vermont could say, if you want to use the word maple in Vermont, it has to be maple, it has to be a real maple product. And so McDonald's had to offer a Vermont maple product as an option for folks that purchased this maple oatmeal in Vermont. How about this one? Did folks notice in 2006 when Maple Grove Farms of Vermont became Maple Grove Farms? So Maple Grove Farms of Vermont, when faced with stricter regulations in 2006 that were passed by the state of Vermont that said, if you say that your product is of Vermont, it has to be of Vermont. If you say that this is 100% pure maple candy, and you say it's Vermont maple candy, and it turns out that it's maple candy, and it was manufactured in Vermont, but the maple syrup is not Vermont maple syrup, that you are in violation of Vermont laws around maple branding and the use of the Vermont label. And in response to that, Maple Grove Farms of Vermont made the economic decision to get rid of Vermont, to just become Maple Grove Farms. So is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Kind of bad, I think, just because they were promoting Vermont at the time, and now they're no longer promoting Vermont.
Others? It's a trade-off, right? I can't tell you if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Is it better to have a product that is not a 100% pure Vermont maple product that advertises the term of Vermont, to associate that with maple syrup all across the country? Or is it better to have a product that is a 100% Vermont maple product, mean that it is a 100% Vermont maple product, that is a brand that has a meaning, that is defined, that is legally defended, that is associated with producer? It's tricky.
Did they study changes in sales?
I don't know, but I'm going to. Okay. Just one more sort of example of the kinds of changes that have implications around Vermont branding, Vermont labeling. Do folks remember this? So, in all of the materials that were put out, I think they sort of do this on purpose, but when you had a sticker, did it just say fancy? For us, it always said Vermont fancy. It always said Vermont grade A, Vermont grade A, Vermont grade B. And a good chunk of our market was built around Vermont grade B. It was built around this, wow, what is grade B? And you say, oh, wow, it's actually not an inferior product. And now you're a more knowledgeable consumer who can make this discerning choice between grade A and grade B and not be, discouraged by a B label. It was a conversation piece. Internationally, cross-boundaryly, from the perspective of large-scale packers, having a product with a grade B label was a bad thing. It was an unequivocal bad thing. And so there was a strong push for changing these labeling schemes, both to be everything's grade A, but also to be consistent, uniform, and compatible with the international grading standards, so that the grades in Canada mean the same thing as the grades in Vermont, mean the same things as the grades in Maine. Well, that's a trade-off. You've gone from a system where there is a unique defining grading label system associated with Vermont to a system in which you are a commodity product that is traded the same and managed the same and handled the same as everyone else. There are potential good things and there are potential bad things. Again, these are empirical questions that we can study and find out if it does end up, if the tick lines change over time, if the curves in production and sales change over time as the grading scheme changed. We don't know yet. But these trade-offs are made whether or not we participate in the decisions. So somebody mentioned organic maple syrup earlier. I wanted to put this up here. A couple of things about organic. So organic means agricultural product that has been produced through approved methods that integrate cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. Folks who are organic certified in the room for your maple? My hand's up. We are. So what's the difference between organic maple syrup and conventional maple syrup? Mm-hmm.
Defoamer.
The defoamer. So we use organic safflower oil. What do you guys use?
We use synthetic defoamer, whatever.
Like most folks use Atmos or something like that. Yeah. So that tiny little drop of oil makes the difference between an organic product and a non-organic product. What else?
The other difference is any sprays, agricultural stuff within a certain distance of your boundary.
Yeah. So it relates to landscape uses around you. If your land gets sprayed for tent forest caterpillar, again, any of those chemical applications will disqualify you. In Canada, where it's a little more common to actively add minerals to your sugaring operation or fertilize your sugaring operations, that's something also that can be a differentiation, not something that we're facing so much in Vermont yet. What else? Yeah.
My husband would be organic, but he insists that he wants to be able to spray paint the holes so he'll see the next year where they were.
Can't use paint on the trees, totally. Flagging, those little rules, those are differences.
That's the reason, because he wants to be able to see where that tackle was, if it healed, and where he goes next year.
So actually, one of the other big differences, sort of under promoted, but big differences between organic certified sugarwoods and conventionally managed sugarwoods is around forest stewardship and rules like you can't harvest all of the non-maples in your woods and create a maple stand. Not that all conventional producers do that at all, but there are some who do that cannot be certified organic, at least by the rules. There are rules about managing your sugar woods to enhance biodiversity over time. So our woods is, a north-facing ledge up in the Northeast Kingdom. One of the only tree species that will grow is the sugar maple. So it's a pretty maple-heavy woods. But a part of our organic certification commitment is we can't reduce the maple percentage. We can't reduce the non-maple percentage in that woods. So effectively, we can only harvest maple trees. We can only remove maple trees from that woods. Otherwise, we'd be reducing the biodiversity. It's a meaningful restriction on your management. Those sort of complex things tend to not be advertised in a country where organic means no chemicals, where organic means this one little narrow thing. Another big piece of what organic does that is different from conventional in the Vermont context is what types of farms tend to be certified organic. A lot of the small ones engage in organic practices, and a lot of the really big ones are certified organic.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing where the combination of certification fees and administrative fees and sort of the payoff to going through the process of being certified organic means that there's a concentration of organic certifications amongst very large producers. So even though you've only got something, between, depending on years, between 10 and 20% of Vermont maple producers are certified organic, which is still a lot, a good share of maple producers certified organic. About half of the syrup coming out of Vermont is certified organic, because so much of it is from these larger operations. The only place where that kind of rate is rivaled is in Maine, where everybody is certified organic, because in Maine you've got these vast operations up on the northern border where the payoff to that organic certification is extremely high. And so what again becomes really interesting is, as you go away from Vermont, as you go out west, do you think organic might in any way in people's minds be associated with supporting a small farm, or with supporting a family farm, or with supporting a natural production practice? For some consumers, maybe. For some consumers, definitely. For some consumers, no. But there are definitely segments out there where those conceptions of organic is small, is family, is rural, is natural, are all intertwined. And that's increasingly departed from the reality, where the certified organic syrup is from large-scale, highly efficient, extraordinary producers, but not necessarily matched with what the consumer is thinking. When we look into our own data and say what are the types of certifications that Vermont maple producers are using to advertise their products, we've done a couple of things. So one is we just asked people, what certifications have you gotten? So this is a survey of 160 Vermont maple producers just collected over the past few months. Half of them having a forest management plan, 20% of them being organic, 10% of those who responded to the survey being Audubon bird friendly certified. Tiny slices that are themselves certified kosher, although some of the packers have relationships and affidavits that make it possible to have even if you don't get yourself certified kosher, your syrup can be part of the kosher batch. We also looked at how producers advertise their products on their websites. And this is a fun sort of machine learning exercise where we now have a database of all of the maple producers that we could find that are selling their products through the web and looking at how they describe themselves, how they advertise their products. And you see, Vermont maple syrup, but you also see family farm as showing up really big. You see organic somewhat. Remember from that big list of consumer willingness to pay, the things that consumers are really willing to pay for, at least in the Vermont context, are Vermont, family farmed, and natural products. So there's some evidence anyway that producers are matching their advertising strategies to these things that consumers are willing to pay for. Just a couple other snapshots on things that producers are doing and not necessarily advertising as much. When you look at production practices in terms of fuel use, Most of the maple syrup that is produced in the state of Vermont is produced using oil. Most of the maple syrup producers in Vermont are still using firewood, are still using wood fuel. So there's an interesting, again, distinction there, where on the one hand, this sort of popular perception of maple syrup coming out of the little smokestacks with the wood pile next to them is still kind of true, in that most producers are producing syrup using wood. But in terms of the syrup that you've purchased from your grocery store chain, it's probably not true. What does that mean for us? 70% of producers scattered across scales are using reverse osmosis. Did everybody see out in the little vendor's space out here, there's now the RO in a bucket that's like $150, and you can install it for your backyard 10-tap operation. Like, this piece of new technology that is radically different from how maple syrup has ever been produced in Vermont is now ubiquitous. It is everywhere. On an efficiency standpoint, it is very difficult to say anything bad about reverse osmosis. It is extraordinary. From a marketing tradition standpoint, it gets very interesting. Is this what consumers think they're paying for? We've also done a series of surveys about what producers see as the concerns, as the threats to them, as what they're trying to adapt to. Here's the results from a survey in 2015, so a couple of years back now, where we broke out responses by the scale of production, trying to look at whether the concerns of the large-scale producers were the same as the concerns of the medium-scale producers, same as the concerns of the small-scale producers. And what we end up seeing are these sort of clusters where if you're a tiny producer, you're relatively more concerned about declining production than if you're a large-scale producer where you're not as concerned about declining production. So these are the operations that are gravity-fed or bucket operations that are concerned about a season just not happening. If you're a small or medium producer, legal issues, concerns around regulation. Again, this is 2015. This is when we're talking about cement floors and sugar houses and needs for running water flush toilets, the potential for more labeling rules to come down the line. If you're a large producer, one of the things that is top on your mind also for medium producers is overproduction, plummeting bulk prices in the market. So concerns about too much syrup being produced and the market price failing, essentially concerns about maple following the path of dairy. When we asked people in 2019, what's the single greatest concern that you have? Number one is low maple syrup prices. Again, scattered across the board, large scale, medium scale, small scale. But number two is really these things related to climate change, is concerns about increased incidences of pest outbreak, forest fires, things that are out of your control that can have extraordinary impacts for this production system and for this increasingly costly infrastructure that you have leading into your production operations. And then number three, coming in strong, was regulatory burdens. Was still concerned about these new rules for added sugars, about new rules for what your production practices could be. I kept other in here because I really liked it. We didn't think to ask. Anybody have a sense of what this other category was about the greatest threat to your maple production operation? It was aging. The write-in response that people gave was aging out and not having someone clearly willing to step up and take over my operation. So I think that intergenerational transfer, particularly when we talk about family farms being one of the things that people are most willing to pay for and strongly associate with Vermont maple syrup, that thinking about that intergenerational transfer piece is also something valuable. We asked a little bit more about specific climate concerns, again, trying to get a sense of how uniform are these fears, how uniform are experiences of climate change risks. Basically, darker bars over here mean more people were really concerned about that thing. Lighter bars here saying, relatively smaller numbers of people believe that they're seeing maple trees actually die as a consequence of climate change. Most of the concerns and the threats that people see that are climate related at the moment are things like variability in the start of the season and the potential threats that people don't yet know about. Just a brief side note on this, we asked questions about climate change in a couple of different ways. So these are all strongly agree means you think that climate change is a severe threat to maple syrup. These are all strongly agree, meaning that you think that climate change is not a severe threat to maple syrup, just to sort of get people's brains thinking in opposite directions. And one of the things that does emerge from these data is that even in Vermont, a lot of your responses to climate change related questions can be explained by political affiliation. That the reported rates of experiencing climate change impacts have something to do with whether you're a Democrat or Republican in response to your survey, and less so about your actual impact on the farm. And so that becomes, again, from a public policy communications perspective, an interesting point, is that if we are certain from a scientific perspective that climate change impacts are posing threats for maple producers, that adaptation strategies might be necessary, recognizing that there are different subsets of the population that are more or less receptive to those communication strategies. Okay, one last piece here on the label. Folks heard a lot about the proposed FDA label changes requiring the labeling of added sugars on maple syrup. Folks were probably really happy when this basically was defeated. With great thanks to some heavy activities by Vermont agencies acting on sugar makers' behalf. But something I wanted to point out is that the rejection of this requirement, which would have made maple producers label their product as containing 23 grams of added sugars in your maple syrup, the exemption was not just for maple syrup. So, the Farm Bill stated that nutrition fact labels cannot require the declaration of the gram amount of added sugars for single ingredient sugars, honey, agave, and syrups, including maple syrup. This sort of policy change was around complaints from honey producers and maple producers that this is an all-natural product. But it extended to agave, which is also an all-natural product, though grown as a field crop, harvested. When we look at maple syrup as a sweetener, one of the questions that I think we need to ask is which of these sweeteners do we want to be? When you look at competing in industrial sweetener markets, when you look at advertising, pure maple syrup is the sap of a maple tree boiled down to a solution that is 67% sugar and contains slightly different micronutrients than your conventional sugars. You are competing in a market where here's maple syrup's price per pound, here's honey's price per pound at about half that, and here's sugar and corn syrup and, to a lesser extent, agave's price per pound. The bottom of the market in prices for industrial sweeteners is way low. I'm not convinced that this is a market in which we want to be competing. When you ask the majority of American consumers, by the way, still, which syrups do you prefer? They still do say they prefer the fake syrup, the non-maple syrup. They still say that they prefer the non-real maple. Again, agave syrup right now with an organic label, 12-ounce bottle is trading for $4. That market threshold is much, much lower than the current market for Vermont pure maple syrup. I think there are actions that can be and will need to be taken to ensure that we stay somehow separated from that industrial market. Somebody mentioned a little earlier, you got to advertise to Japan, you got to advertise to those international markets, those fast-growing Asian markets. Is it possible to have the Vermont brand of maple syrup extend to those markets? Potentially, yes. This is actually the most popular brand of curry in Japan right now. That totally says Vermont curry. It's one of those weird things that has happened where this apple and honey curry is now the top curry selling in Japan, associated associated with natural, associated with these kinds of things that we sort of associate Vermont with? Is it possible to build an international brand around Vermont pure maple syrup? Why not? Again, it's an open question. It's a matter of investment. I do think it's important to recognize that Asian markets, though fast-growing, are not unlimited. That there are a bunch of maple species and traditional maple drinks that are produced in Asian countries. That there are some maple species that are produced in Western Asia and Eastern Europe. That there are alternatives to maple, that if we try to compete internationally as a commodity maple syrup product, that we will face a lot of competition from a lot of different options. The end result here is we're really looking at the differences between treating maple syrup as a commodity and treating maple syrup as a heritage. Whether we want to enter a commodities market and try to compete on the dollar-for-dollar efficiency margins, or if we want to try to enter a specialty products market, is it possible for the Vermont brand to hold national or international appeal? We are in a scenario where the smaller operations are either staying the same size or getting smaller, and the larger operations are either staying the same size or often getting bigger. And where the new operations that just appear are often very, very big. Where the sector changes, where we don't have the option of standing still, where the sector is changing whether or not we are moving. Sort of going back to my initial figure, are there overlaps? All natural, organic are things that consumers want to pay for. Resilient is something that producers want to have. Vermont Family Farm is something that consumers want to pay for. Vermont Family Farm is something that producers want to keep. That's a lot of happy overlap. The only term that are in this list that currently are regulated are Vermont and organic. All natural is not. Family farm is not. These are terms that are used but don't have legal meaning, don't have legal force. Things that are really, really important, but there's no current protections for. Major trade-offs between sustainability, local production, and viability, efficiency, and scale. These are questions that we're going to continue to grapple with as a sector. I hope that you will look at some of this research. I hope that you will help us continue to ask questions that will allow us to fairly present to policymakers and to our industry leaders what it is that Vermont maple syrup means to Vermonters and what it is that Vermont maple producers want to retain on their farms. Thank you. Happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Maybe a little off topic, but the kosher thing.
Yeah.
I tried to go for that, and because I was selling to some bakeries, and they initially buy it, and they come back and they say, by the way, are you kosher? And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to get the certification, and if I got a name of a rabbi and everything, then I talked, and this bakery wanted me to talk to their rabbi. And he was like, well, not all rabbis are the same. So like, it's words. But he was basically like, you have to have a nationally recognized rabbi in order for us to, for a lot of places. So how did you go about getting your kosher?
Yeah, we did some research. We do have someone that comes up out of Pennsylvania as part of sort of a circuit of certifying, and someone who specializes in medium scale operations. So it's a little bit expensive. For us, it was something that we did not undertake until we had a market defined for it, where we had a customer who said, we will purchase this much over the next couple of years if you can become certified kosher, and it was worth it for us. But it was a careful decision, and it is not inexpensive.
Yeah, just a comment, but I think it'd be very interesting to see the same questions asked to Californians. Kind of asked
Totally.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Beside the industry.
And that is where we're at, absolutely.
And most customers I talk to when it comes to organic, they're really thinking pesticides.
Yep.
They're not thinking for self.
not in the rest of the country.
They're thinking of a paper sprays. That's the vision they have.
How come there was a variance on one of your charts there from your survey Vermont households? One survey said 626 and the other one said 527.
It was the year,
But-
the year of the survey. There were 2 years of survey data reported here, 2015 and 2019. Or in some cases, we asked questions only of people who purchased with the survey.
Okay.
So if we cut out those people who hadn't purchased anything to serve in the past year, we didn't ask them, what we were labeling preferences.
And your chart on kind of climate change, the reverse questions,
Yep.
and you mentioned political affiliation. How do you know that?
Yeah,
Was it in
that's
the
what I was
survey?
In the survey. Yeah.
Really?
Yes, political affiliation as a demographic in the survey.
So
Yes, sir, or did you get?
So, yes,
I
solid
thought
responses.
everybody would just ask.
There's a few of them.
So why wasn't it on there, the percentage of each of the group?
In the full write-up, which we will post online as soon as we can.
Cool, which pretty basically told us the answer anyways, I mean, at least the. Yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
I think I've done that, I'm not sure.
Then what?
I've done that survey, I think.
Oh, you have done it?
Yeah, I think so, I'm not sure, it looked familiar.
Cool.
It seemed to me that you made a pretty good case for that new Vermont label that I personally don't like and I don't buy.
Yes, yeah, there's somebody else that doesn't like it.
Well, I would have because it's cheaper, because it's an association judge, I buy association judge cheaper because I'm in the association.
I know.
But I have an apple orchard that I supply in the fall, and they didn't like it, and I'm not going to get any different kinds of jugs.
Totally. No, totally. We actually use our own jugs. We ship everything to Seattle. We got a square gallon jug that fits in a plastic shipping container.
Oh, that makes
And,
sense. Yeah. Much easier to ship that way, isn't
And
it?
you're around here, people say, that looks like a Wyndham's bottle, but you're in Seattle, they won't care. It's got your nice little farm logo, right?
Supposedly the logic behind the new label was exactly what you were pointing out that we should be marketing was outside of Vermont. Well, that's just a barn on the label. They don't recognize that it's a sugar house.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Marketing outside the
but if
country,
we're
too.
marketing it outside the state, it seems to me that, I mean, okay, that's fine for a label in the state, I guess. But if you're marketing outside the state, or potentially it's going to go outside the state, it should have a sugar house. I mean, there's nothing on there Vermont except for the little Vermont at the very bottom.
Exactly, that's what I said, and it's so bland, I mean, blah, it's just
But
a
there's
dull
so-called
gray.
researchers said it stands out. Well, apparently when you got all these others with sugar houses on them, that green